For 16 centuries, the world believed one man destroyed Rome from the outside. But new DNA evidence just revealed something far stranger about who he really was. If this story pulls at you even a little, stay close, because by the end, you might feel differently about everything you thought you knew about the people history called monsters. There was a name that could empty entire cities just by being whispered. Attila, leader of the Huns. For hundreds of years, that name meant only one thing: fear. Roman writers described his people as savages from nowhere. Wild riders who came out of the eastern darkness with no home, no mercy, and no reason for existing except destruction. They said the Huns weren't fully human. They said they drank blood. They said they were born on horseback and never touched the ground. They said the earth itself turned to ash wherever the Huns rode. For centuries, that was the story everyone believed. The Huns were the villains of the ancient world, a faceless horde. A single terrifying mass with no individual. Identity, no culture, no history of their own worth remembering. But here's the strange part. The people who wrote most of these stories were the very people the Huns were attacking. Roman historians, writers who watched their world shake and needed someone to blame. And that raises a question that historians have quietly asked for generations. What if the story we inherited was never really about who the Huns were? What if it was about who Rome needed them to be? Because fear does something strange to memory. It doesn't just record an enemy. It reshapes them. It strips away their humanity so they become easier to hate and easier to justify destroying. For 1600 years, nobody could challenge that old story because nobody could ask the Huns themselves. Their voices were gone, their language mostly lost, their side of history buried under someone else's ink, until now. Because science just did something historians never could. It reached into the ground, into ancient bones nobody had touched in over 1,000 years, and it asked a question no Roman writer ever bothered to ask. Who were these people? Really? And the answer that came back was not what anyone expected. Let's rewind for a moment, back to the beginning of the legend, because to understand how wrong the old picture was, you first need to understand how deep it went. In the 4th century, a group of horse-riding warriors appeared on the edges of Europe like they had come from nowhere. They moved fast. They fought in ways European armies had never seen. Their bows could strike from a distance most soldiers thought was safe. Their horses seemed like extensions of their own bodies. City after city fell. Kingdom after kingdom bent under the pressure. And the terror they created didn't just come from swords and arrows, it came from the unknown. Nobody in Rome understood where these riders came from, what they wanted, or why they seemed impossible to stop. So the stories grew wild. Roman writers, desperate to explain the unexplainable, painted the Huns as almost inhuman, ugly beyond imagination, cruel beyond reason, a people without settlements, without families, without anything resembling normal life. This was the birth of one of history's most powerful myths, the Huns as pure chaos, a storm with no origin and no soul. And at the center of that storm stood one man, Attila. To Roman writers, he was called the Scourge of God, a punishment sent to break the world. His name alone could make entire populations flee their homes. Stories said he never lost a battle he truly wanted to win. Stories said kings knelt just to keep their cities standing. For centuries, this legend never really faded. It became the foundation for how the Huns were remembered in nearly every book, painting, and film that followed. Faceless invaders, a tidal wave of violence with no deeper identity underneath it. But somewhere along the way, a quiet question started forming in the minds of a few careful historians. A question that felt almost dangerous to ask. What if that image was built entirely from the perspective of the people they were attacking? Think about it for a second. Every single detailed account we had of the Huns came from Roman or Greek writers. Not one word came from the Huns describing themselves. Not one surviving record shows their own explanation for who they were, where they came from, or what they believed. That's not history. That's one side of a story, dressed up to look complete. And once historians started noticing that gap, the questions began multiplying. If the loudest voice in this story belonged only to the enemy of the Huns, how much of what we call fact and myth was actually just fear, translated into ink? For a long time, that question had no real answer because there was no way to check it. Archaeology found graves, it found weapons, it found bones. But bones don't tell stories, or at least that's what everyone believed until science found a way to make them speak. If you're starting to feel that uneasy pull, that sense that maybe history got this one very wrong, don't scroll past it. Sit with it for a second, because it's about to get even more surprising. For decades, archaeologists quietly dug up burial sites linked to the Hun period across parts of Europe and Central Asia. They found skeletons, weapons, jewelry, horse harnesses. Some skulls even showed an unusual shape, elongated on purpose, a practice some ancient cultures used to mark status or identity. But bones alone couldn't answer the biggest question. Where did these people actually come from? For a long time, historians debated two main possibilities. Some believed the Huns were a branch of a powerful nomadic group from deep in Central Asia, possibly connected to peoples the Chinese historical records once called the Xiongnu, who had clashed with Chinese dynasties centuries earlier. Others argued the two groups had little real connection at all, and the whole idea was more legend than fact. For years, this debate had no clear winner, because there was no tool precise enough to settle it. Until genetic science advanced enough to read the deepest layers of human history hidden inside ancient DNA, researchers began extracting genetic material from skeletons buried across a huge stretch of land, from areas linked to the Hun eras in Europe, all the way back toward regions in Asia connected to earlier steppe cultures. This wasn't easy work. Ancient DNA is fragile. It can be damaged by time, weather, and contamination. But new techniques made it possible to pull out enough genetic information to start piecing together a picture nobody could ever draw before. And what the DNA started to reveal was not simple at all. It wasn't a single clean bloodline confirming one legend. It was something far more complicated and far more human. The genetic data suggested that the people we call the Huns were not one unified group with one single origin. Some individuals carried genetic connections stretching back toward Inner Asia, supporting the old theory that at least part of their ancestry came from powerful nomadic groups further east. But many others showed a much more mixed genetic background, blending ancestry from the local European populations they had encountered, conquered, allied with, or absorbed along the way. In other words, the Huns weren't a single race that appeared out of nowhere. They were something much closer to a moving alliance, a coalition of many different peoples, tribes, and bloodlines pulled together over generations of migration, war, and survival. That single discovery quietly shatters one of the oldest myths in this story. The Huns were never one bloodline charging out of the unknown to destroy the world. They were a blend of human histories, stitched together across an enormous stretch of land and time. And once you understand that, the entire old picture starts to crack even further. Because if the Huns were genetically diverse, built from many different peoples merging together, then the Roman description of them as a single terrifying race with one shared identity was never really accurate. It was a simplified nightmare, built to explain something Rome didn't understand and couldn't control. This is where the story stops being just about ancient bones and starts becoming something deeper, something about how humans have always struggled to explain the people who frighten them. Think about how easy it is, even today, to turn a group of strangers into a single terrifying idea, to stop seeing individuals and start seeing only the fear they represent. The Romans did that to the Huns 1,600 years ago, and the DNA is now quietly showing us how wrong that fear made their picture. If this is starting to feel less like ancient history and more like something painfully familiar, you're not imagining it. Stay with the story, because the next layer changes things again. Because genetics wasn't the only surprise waiting in the ground. Researchers also studied patterns in diet, lifestyle, and even how these ancient people lived day to day, based on chemical signatures preserved in their bones and teeth. And this evidence told a story that felt almost impossible to match with the old Roman legend. Roman writers described the Huns as people with no fixed homes, wanderers who never settled, never farmed, never built anything permanent, a people defined only by movement and war. But the physical evidence tells a more complicated story. Some burial sites suggest certain groups linked to the Hun period lived in ways that included farming, herding, and periods of settled life, not constant, chaotic wandering. Some graves included items suggesting trade, craftsmanship, and cultural exchange with neighboring peoples, not just conquest. This doesn't erase the reality that Hun armies were fierce and highly skilled in mounted warfare. That part of history stands firm, but it does challenge the idea that they were nothing more than a war machine with no deeper culture behind it. It suggests something historians have started saying more carefully in recent years. The society behind the Hun military might have been far more structured, more adaptable, and more complex than ancient writers gave them credit for. And that raises an important question that quietly reframes everything. If the Huns had structure, culture, and diverse ancestry woven together over generations, then why does history remember them as pure chaos? The answer might not be about the Huns at all. It might be about Rome. Because Rome, at the height of the Hun invasions, was not the unshakable empire it once had been. It was already fractured, already strained by internal conflict, economic pressure, and political instability. And when a powerful outside force pushes hard enough against something already cracking, the people inside that structure often need someone to blame. An enemy that is simply strong is frightening. But an enemy that is inhuman, chaotic, and impossible to understand, that's easier to justify losing to. If the Huns were remembered as a monstrous, faceless storm, then Rome's struggles against them felt less like failure and more like an unavoidable natural disaster. Nobody blames themselves for losing to something described as unstoppable and inhuman. This is where the story stops being only about ancient warriors and becomes something almost uncomfortable in how familiar it feels. Powerful civilizations, when frightened or weakened, have a long history of turning outsiders into symbols instead of people, simplifying complicated human groups into a single terrifying idea, because that idea is easier to fight, easier to fear, and easier to remember. The Huns may have been the earliest large-scale example of this in Western memory. A diverse, complex group of human beings, reduced across centuries into a single word that meant only destruction. And the truth researchers are now uncovering doesn't erase the pain the Hun invasions caused. Real people suffered. Real cities fell. Real fear was justified in the moment. But the deeper truth adds something history had quietly erased for 1,600 years. It adds their humanity back. If you've made it this far, something in the story is clearly holding your attention. Maybe it's the mystery. Maybe it's the unfairness. Whatever it is, let it sit with you for one more layer, because the biggest twist is still ahead. Because there's one more piece to this puzzle, one that touches Attila himself, the man history turned into a symbol of pure terror. For centuries, Attila was described almost like a force of nature rather than a person. Roman writers barely gave him human dimension. He was written as unstoppable, merciless, almost mythical in his cruelty. But newer historical analysis, combined with a broader understanding of steppe political structures at the time, paints a more layered picture. Attila wasn't simply a warlord riding for destruction. He was also a political leader managing alliances between many different peoples under his control. He negotiated, he formed treaties. He used diplomacy as often as he used war. Some historians point out that Attila even understood Roman politics deeply enough to manipulate them, playing different factions within the crumbling empire against each other. That's not the behavior of a mindless force of chaos. That's the behavior of a calculated, intelligent leader operating in an extremely complex political world. This doesn't erase the destruction his campaigns caused. Cities were burned. Communities were shattered. That reality remains true and important. But it does challenge the flattened, almost cartoonish version of Attila that history handed down for generations. A man remembered only as a monster, when the evidence suggests he was something far more complicated. A skilled leader operating in a brutal age, where power was often built on the same violence used by every other empire around him, including Rome itself. And that brings the story to its final, quiet question. The one that lingers after all the DNA, the diplomacy, and the diverse ancestry are laid out on the table. Were the Huns really the villains history remembers? Or were they simply the outsiders history needed to blame? Because empires rarely fall from a single external enemy alone. They weaken slowly, from internal strain, economic pressure, political division, long before any outside force delivers the final blow. Rome was no different. The Huns applied pressure at a moment when the empire was already fragile. And instead of confronting that fragility, history chose a simpler explanation. Blame the outsiders. Turn them into monsters. Let their name carry the weight of an empire's decline. The DNA now tells a different, more human story. The Huns weren't a single terrifying bloodline that appeared from nowhere to erase civilization. They were a complex mixture of peoples, built from generations of migration, alliance, and adaptation. Some ancestry may trace back to powerful nomadic groups from Eurasia. Some blended with European populations they encountered along their journey. Together, they formed something history flattened into a single terrifying word, when the reality was layered, human, and far more complicated than any old legend admitted. This story isn't really about proving the Huns were peaceful. They weren't. War was central to their world, just as it was central to Rome's. This story is about something bigger. It's about how history remembers frightened moments, and how those memories can erase the humanity of people who never got the chance to speak for themselves. For 1,600 years, the Huns existed only through the eyes of the people who feared them. Now, quietly, carefully, science is giving a small piece of their story back. Not a perfect picture, not a complete one. Historians still debate many details, and some questions may never be fully answered, but enough to remind us that behind every legend of pure monsters, there were once real people, real families, real choices, and real lives far more complicated than fear ever allowed history to record. Maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside this ancient mystery, not just what happened to Rome, or who the Huns really were, but how easily fear can turn people into legends, and how long it can take for the truth to find its way back to the surface. If this story changed even a small part of how you see the Huns, or made you think differently about how history remembers the people we call enemies, that's worth carrying with you. Because somewhere in these ancient bones is a quiet reminder that every villain history remembers was once someone else's whole world, waiting, even after 1,600 years, for someone to finally listen.